Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bad Luck Gamer, and today we're going to be talking about why Indominant, the superhero RPG that is coming out by Odin's Key Gaming, is awesome. Definitely something I'm trying to get started here on the channel is a little bit more variety content, but there will be some extra videos coming from this one, so keep an eye on the channel if you are indeed interested in Indominant, because I'm going to be going over the different archetypes and power sets that are currently in the game in some future videos. So if you're excited about this game, stay tuned, and I recommend subscribing to the channel, as honestly, besides Odin Key's own channel for their game, there's not really a lot on the internet about it right now, so, you know, it's kind of one of your only places to get it, at least at this time, but who knows? It could very much pick up in the community because I think there is a lot to offer. But overhyping the game aside, let's talk about first what is Indominant. So I already mentioned it is a superhero-based TTRPG game by Odin's Key Gaming. Now, it's a pretty good one, and it is a lot more regimented than some of the other superhero-based TTRPGs out there. One really good example is the Mutants and Masterminds, kind of like one of the go-tos for superhero-based TTRPGs. Indominant specifically is a lot better contained, a lot better balanced, and it has some very familiar systems that I think a lot of people are going to enjoy, and it incorporates some of my favorite TTRPG systems like exploding dice, which I'll get to here in a little bit if you don't know what exploding dice are. Now, Odin's Key Gaming, as a gaming, I guess, company or at least group, are just two dads, a Mr. Zarek Odensky, who is a very wonderful fellow. He's come on to my channel several times for some of my videos, or has been on our various table talks, or at least in the chat in our various table talks. I'm probably going to bring him on here sometime in the near future to kind of talk about their game more in person, because I know they've been very excited about this game, and I'm all about elevating smaller developers in the TTRPG space, since we're kind of coming into a new variety age for tabletop, it feels like. Along with Zarek, we also have Ricardo Rivera, another dad. They're both dads, and who is very much in the TTRPG space, has been into it since college, and has gotten even more into it after starting his family. Not someone I've talked to too much personally, but based on the design of the game, it's absolutely wonderful. And speaking about wonderful as well, I do love their logo for Odin Key Gaming. I think this logo is really, really cool. And their website is very impeccably designed. It's very beautiful to look at, and it gives you pretty much a lot of the information you are looking for. But I'm going to make a special mention because this was kind of not super obvious when I was going through it. So the game is not currently fully out, but that is quickly on the horizon. You can get in on their backer kit, where you can get the Supers Codex, which is their full book, which is going to have a lot more. But if you're interested in it currently, either going through the backer kit or just buying it outright, you can get the primer, the 2.0 primer, where you can play essentially the first 5 levels of Indominant. And based on this style of game, those first 5 levels, you're going to feel powerful, and they're going to take a significant amount of time, so you can easily get out 20, 30, maybe even 40 sessions in that range based on how your group likes to do XP. Though, for me personally, it's a really good, like, 10 to 20 session kind of setup where you can really get your teeth sunk into the system. Speaking on the system, Indominant is very familiar to those who have played really any kind of TTRPG, especially D&D. This is a D20 based system, though it uses all the other die types for things like percentile or damage or whatever. And it has a very standard stat setup of, you got your main stats, which are like your attributes, you got skill proficiencies, and then specific modifiers given or taken away based on certain circumstances. So as just a brief example, if you want to make a biology roll, for instance, you're going to add your intelligence stat plus your biology skill plus any extra modifiers, which we'll talk about here in a moment, and then a d20 on top for a basic roll somewhere probably in the mid-teens or upper 10 range, which is not particularly bad in the system, especially because the check difficulties in this game are actually not that high, with the basic giving a range, which is rather interesting. I like the flexibility, since a lot of games do states that you can adjust the difficulties, but they don't really give you like an expected range. I really appreciate that Indominant here gives us a expected range. A simple check is a result of 6 to 8. A average check, which is one probably you're going to see the most, is going to be 9 to 11, and so on and so forth. And considering how you start off the game, your character is probably going to have up to 3 points in a stat that they are particularly good at. And there's actually skill expertises, which give you a flat bonus of your skill rank +3. So when you start the game, you actually are going to probably be rolling with a +6, making simple checks an automatic success unless you get a nat 1. Yes, this system does use the nat 20, nat 1 system that many of you are familiar with an added difference. So there are modifiers in the game, one of the most prominent being its dominance and weakness system. This is a very interesting system because as your dominance stacks, the bonus die you roll with your check increases by a step. So if you have 1 dominance on a check, you're going to be rolling with an additional d4 with your d20. And if you have 2, it's a d6, 3, it's a d8, so on and so forth, up to potentially rolling 2 d20s. Now, as far as this book is concerned, I did not see too many ways to stack dominance that high, but when the official book releases, I'm sure we're going to see higher level abilities that allow you to more easily stack your dominance to get these higher die types. And inversely, weakness reduces your checks by the same step. So minus a d4 or a d6 or a d8. And if you're rolling with both for whatever reason, you subtract 1 from the higher amount of the other, and then either they neutral out or you're left with a reduced amount. So for 3 dominance and 1 weakness, you'll be rolling with 2 dominance or a d6 added on to your roll. Now, I actually really like this rather than the advantage-disadvantage system because it does actually increase the chance of you rolling a bigger minimum, though the overall potential is a bit less. Rolling with advantage, obviously, in a system typically gives you a very high check. Likely, there's some statistics out there that say it's relatively close to like a +5, essentially, to your roll. While this system, you're probably at most going to be rolling with an additional d4 or d6, but considering the difficulties that I mentioned before, you can easily kind of hit those checks even with just that added amount, and it does increase your minimum because the most you're going to get, or the least you're going to get, is at least an additional +1, which if you play a d20 system, you know that every +1 matters. The one thing I kind of dislike about this system, though, is that the increasing die is very interesting, but it doesn't really actually increase the range with every step by too much. The average essentially increases by 1 point per die step, meaning that even at a d20, which you can't even really normally get, you're only adding potentially a +10, which when you're going through so much effort is a lot potentially, but you could also just roll a 1 on the additional die, which means you put a lot of effort in to just get what you could have gotten on a d4. So I think the system's very interesting. I love upgrading die systems for sure, but I just want to make that one mention that if you're focusing too much on the dominance system, you're not necessarily going to guarantee better results, even if you're putting in better efforts. It's likely better, but not guaranteed better. So your extra effort might go to waste, which won't feel great, but in practice, I think this is overall pretty good. Another special thing about the dice system I want to make mention of before I really get into the review is their critical dice explosion, essentially. So whenever your character makes a critical hit, either by rolling a 20 or some other effect that gets them to 20. Oh yeah, I also forgot. So you get a nat 20 by rolling a 20 on the d20, but if a dominance die gets you at 20 or above, it's considered a nat 20. And similarly, there is nat 1s, and if a weakness die drops you to 1 or below, minimum 0, then you're going to get a natural 1. So you can actually expand your crit range by using dominance, which I think is really cool. And when you crit, as I was talking about before, you double the damage dice that you would do, and those dice can now explode. Exploding dice, if you're not familiar with it, typically what happens is whenever you roll a exploding die and it rolls its highest face value, so like a d6 rolling a 6, for instance, you would either roll the die again, causing it to get a higher value, or like here in Indominant, you just double the value. So when you get that critical hit that I was just talking about, if you rolled a d6 or a 6 on any of those d6s, then that 6 essentially doubles again. So you're adding even more damage, essentially causing some very extreme results when you get a critical hit, meaning that the dominant system is really powerful, especially because of these exploding dice on critical hits. So now that I've talked about the base dice system and essentially how the game works at a very basic level, I'm going to get into a more thorough part of the review here. But before I do want to say that Odin's Key Gaming did send me a copy of their primer for free, but this review is on my own. All my thoughts and opinions are mine, and they didn't actively pay me. They only gave me the primer. Just so you know, I'm going to give my most impartial review, even though this is a Why This Game is Awesome series. I think even games that are not the peak can still be awesome, though Indominant is still pretty good. So what makes Indominant different than other TTRPGs or other hero-based TTRPGs? Well, I haven't necessarily looked at every single hero TTRPG out there, so it's hard to say exactly what's different. But if I compare this to Mutants and Masterminds, the main thing that comes to my mind is mostly the general accessibility. Making a character is not a stat sheet spread, for instance. And also, it's a more familiar dice system using the D20 and modifiers and bonuses kept to a relatively easy level of understanding. It's not a game that has excessive math, but this is a crunchy game, don't get me wrong. There is a lot here. In addition to that, it has some very interesting dice systems that I thoroughly enjoy, like exploding dice or its dominance and weakness with upgrading dice. I think those are both really, really cool. And the amount of customizability for your characters is actually pretty insane. Now, speaking on characters, your characters have the basic stats or attributes you would see in other games, though slightly different. In this game, we have just 5 core attributes rather than 6 that you would normally see, or 8. We have agility, durability, intellect, might, and power. These are all pretty self-explanatory. Agility essentially affects is essentially your dex and any other kind of game. Might is essentially strength. Intellect is intellect. Durability is essentially constitution. Power is a little bit more unique, though, as power is specifically the use of your powers. Mostly used when using your powers in combat, though there are skills that use your power, like the infuse skill. Infusion allows you to use your powers to some non-combat degree. Like if you have electricity powers, you could use it to overcharge an electric panel, causing it to malfunction, for instance. I actually thoroughly like this, and power and infusion both make for interesting skill checks that can happen in your game, which I think is really cool. There's also a fair number of skills here. They say they're going to have 20 in the final book, and I think they have 20 here. Yeah, 20 different skills here. Though with any TTRPG, honestly, finite number of skills never really fully encompass everything a character can do, and I can definitely see some spots where a skill might not be here, but the basics are. We have our survival, we have our sneak, We have our cunning, which is something like deception that you might use in some other games. Or we have just straight up deception, which is different because this deception is a social skill, while cunning is more for like sleight of hand kind of stuff like that. And we have, intimidation, persuasion, and the like. Honestly, a pretty fair range, and it covers most of the basics you're going to see regular in play. Now, an interesting thing about skills is you don't actually start your character off with any skill points. Instead, Odin's Key decided that you should get skill experience, so the more you use skills, the more powerful they will become, which is pretty interesting, though it is a little bit micromanagey. Every time you're making a skill check, you have the potential to gain experience. Every 10 experience increases that skill by 1 point up to a maximum of 10. As you can see here, failing a check gives you 1 experience, succeeding a check gives you 2, and getting a nat 20, whether the check actually succeeds or not, gives you a +3. And the comic editor, which is this game's version of the GM, can always reward you experience in your skills whenever you want. There is also basic leveling, but we'll get to that here in a little bit. But your skills specifically all start at 0. You will have 4 expertises, maybe a little bit more, depending on some other choices you might make, which give you a +3. So your character essentially is starting off with 4 +3 skills. And then the more you use a skill, the more experience you will get. Now, my main thought with this is I like it. I think using skills and getting XP motivates players to use skills, but it might also cause players to harass a GM to use a skill at any opportunity, which can get a little annoying as a GM personally. And like I said before, it's also very micromanaging. Now, 10 points isn't necessarily a lot, but that's also another problem. 10 XP is not a lot. That means it's only 100 experience points to get a stat essentially fully maxed out. And based on the difficulty table we saw before that maxed out at 24, a +10 is pretty insane. That's not even including the expertise bonus that a player can get. So that being said, if you're not managing this well, if you're asking your players for a lot of skill checks, or your players are just finagling their way to roll skills a lot, it can be pretty easy to get players with bonkers skills. Now, that might not be a problem in your games, but this can be a problem for some, and so I figured I'd make mention of it. Now, towards the beginning of this video, I did mention that this is a somewhat chunky game, and they have rules for everything, whether it's lifting capacity, how far you can jump, all those kind of standards you get in the slightly more crunchier TTRPGs, but not to a necessarily excessive range, so I do appreciate it. I think that they've done overall a good job of representing the full list. Just here in the primer, too. This isn't even the full book yet. So in the primer, a lot of the questions you might ask about your characters is very easily solvable here in the various pages where you can find those kind of things. And they do have some really good charts in tables that show you how cones work and the like. A very thorough primer that pretty much gives you everything you need to play the game, at least for the first 5 levels. Overall, I think this is a really good and a very well-designed book. It gives you step-by-step everything you need, and I think overall it works. But I do want to take this moment to offer my biggest gripe about not even the book necessarily or the game, but the way the text is set out. So I have some minor dyslexia. It takes me a little bit of time to read certain kind of words based on composition or just the way they look. My brain will scramble some things or add letters or just misrepresent what I'm actually reading. And they have this text literally everywhere in the book, all over the place, and it causes my brain short moments of extra working time to read a word. They have this font that they either made themselves, purchased, or whatever, that has these lines kind of intersecting the letters. And while it definitely is cool, and I don't mind it for things like titles, it's literally everywhere. I don't mind it for like the titles of certain chapters, but you get certain sections like this where it's all through the most important text, which does make it harder for people like me to skim through it. Now, some of my friends have looked at this and don't necessarily have the same problem, but I'm speaking with someone who does have a somewhat literary problem with certain font types. If I was to give a certain recommendation, either one, just leave it to the titles. So at the very least, it's not so prevalent, especially in like bulk text. Don't do this in bulk text. Or make it where something like on their website, they have it where they have like a back, like it has a backfill that's a different color than the background. So it kind of separates that word as a full block by itself. That makes it somewhat easier for me to read. But this is everywhere, and I actually hate it. So I'm glad you guys found a font type that you really do like. More power to you. But this is incredibly infuriating for me to read sometimes when I've read this book several times now to get ready for this video, and it trips me up literally every time. So cool font. Try to keep it to a minimum, or at least make it a lot easier for people with dyslexia like myself. It just makes it a lot more difficult. Now, speaking on overall rules, this is a typically set up grid-based combat, which they give a whole section talking about how to set up how movement in different increments work for certain kind of things, even if you're going gridless, which I think is really cool. But this is a hero-based system, so either one, at the later levels, they're going to have to restrict them. Otherwise, players are going to break the map because characters will be able to move super far or, create massive areas or the like. Or it's just going to get to a point where like you're using a grid until you no longer can use a grid. I don't necessarily have a problem with this, and I do like grid-based combats, especially because they do mention like hexes, which I'm a more particular fan of. But it's something that you're either going to have to keep the system constrained, which, by the way, they do say that even the most powerful heroes typically are on just a planetary scale. So the most powerful heroes are like the equivalent of a nuclear bomb, for instance, rather than like blowing up planets. But that still has a lot of potential for characters to kind of break maps and the like. So I will have to, maybe I'll give a review when the actual codex comes out. But for now, it's a grid-based game for the most part for a lot of their core rules. And you can just freeball it if you really want. Kind of the same with other TTRPGs. Nothing too special here, but I just want to figure I mention. And they did write out very well how to use this with different types of grid systems or layouts, which I really appreciate. But now let's get to the part I'm sure many of you have been waiting for. The characters, what can you do? What kind of powers can you have and the like? So Indominant uses a very interesting system of multiple parts. The core being you're going to pick your character's origins, where you get your powers from. Are you magic-based, mutation-based? This actually does change some very core aspects of your character. You get special bonuses to certain things, but you might get a penalty to some other things depending on what you pick. Magic, for instance, adds +1 to all their damage die results, which is kind of cool. And along with your origin, you're going to pick a species. Each species group gets several different unique abilities. These might be more narratively focused or in combat focused, but they're more the general flavor of your character, and all characters from the same group have generally the same abilities. All aliens, for instance, have alien physiology, which allows them to persist in environments that normal humans can't do, like being in space, for instance. Not necessarily useful in most combats, but can be very useful in some very specific scenarios that can happen in your campaign. They also have callings, what your character's main purpose or goals are in the game. These are actually also very interesting. You can be a contractor, for instance, and these give you mostly narratively based benefits. Contractors are professional heroes paid by the GLU, the in-universe government, and they get special benefits for that, but they might also have some cons, as you can see here. Like if they're not on a current job, people suspect that they might be doing something illegal, giving a little bit of extra notoriety when they're kind of off the clock. But beyond most of these mostly narratively focused elements, we have the core archetype and power sets. So archetypes are very interesting because they give your character a basic template to work off of for the rest of the game. So archetypes and power sets are currently locked in. You can't do multiple different power sets, for instance, at least as of yet. The Codex might have more on this. And something I should state as well, they have a Discord that currently has a bunch of rule discussions and extra stuff like that. If anything has been mentioned there, I haven't been able to pick it up. As you all may know, I have a newborn and I've spent a lot of time taking care of her, so I can mostly just read the book. And I'm also not a big fan of rules and special stuff being found only in Discords. It makes it a lot harder to do research, but that's a whole nother video. Anyway, not saying that's even the case. I'm just saying that if there are, I'm sorry, I just haven't found the information myself. But back to archetypes. So archetypes are insanely cool because your characters are currently locked in. They do change a lot of what happens, and there's actually a lot of variability. First of all, the archetype changes what your attack modifier is, which is really cool. So, for instance, if you're a hunter, your attack modifier is based on your agility score. But if you're a blaster, it's actually based on your power. So whenever you're making your character at the get-go, you're going to look at your template and you're going to adjust your numbers based on your template. And your template is also going to give you a +1 to one of your core stats, though none of your stats can be higher than 3, including the bonus. So if you have a +1 to durability, for instance, you're not going to be able to get a 4 starting out. It's only going to be a maximum of 3. And I said before, you get 5, or did I say before? I don't remember, but you get 5 stat points that you can allocate on your character sheet. So likely you're going to have a 3, maybe 2 if you really want to hyper focus your character, but more than likely you're going to have a 3, 2, and maybe some 1s to make sure your stats are relatively rounded out. When you start the game, your character is only going to have those 5 + 1, so technically 6 stats. So even if you want to be spread out, that would mean you would only have a +2 in your core stat or your main stat for your archetype, and then a 1 in everything else. Though a stat of 0 isn't bad like it is in a lot of other TTRPGs, it just means your character is not exceptional in that range. All these stat points represent your character's elevation above your standard citizen, more or less. So even just 2 points is pretty massive. Another interesting thing is your character actually gets a standard range if you're using any ranged abilities your power set might give you. So characters like the Bruiser, for instance, won't have a massive range, only a range of 4 squares, for instance, while a Hunter is going to have a range of 7, making them a lot more ranged focused than a more melee-based character. Now, an interesting thing for each of these archetypes is how they work with a stat called Drive. Drive is essentially your character's stamina or magic points or whatever. It's a resource you use to use some of your powers. And you have some base powers that are, of course, aren't going to use Drive, but some of your more impactful ones will use Drive. And in addition to this, you're going to have ways to recover this drive either in combat or, whatever scenario might come up. For instance, the Hunter doesn't have a general difference in how their drive works to other characters, but they can recover drive equal to the recovery value whenever they successfully affect an enemy with an offensive power once per round. So the system actually uses a resource system that is constantly going up and down in combat based on how effective you are at whatever your archetype is kind of based around. I like how the archetypes change the way you want to play the game, making it easier for you to kind of fall into certain play styles. So whenever you start this game, try a few sessions out, find an archetype that really works for you, and then go from there. And in addition to all this, each of the archetypes do offer unique abilities that you get at level 1 and 3 as far as the primer is concerned, though I'm sure we're going to get more as this is actually intended to be a 1 to 20 system, similar to D&D. So that being said, we have 3 times more content coming out for this game. You know, we're only at a quarter of what is potentially available, which I think is really cool. In addition to the additional abilities, you also get expertises based on whatever you pick for your origin, which I didn't mention before, and for your archetype. So, for instance, for the Guardian, we have civics, physics, piloting, and survival. You get 2 expertises, which, as I mentioned before, give you a +3, making you generally good at those kinds of things. Now, in addition to your archetypes, you get a power set included with that. There are 10 different power sets in the game. Those powers are currently earth manipulation, electricity manipulation, fire manipulation, ice manipulation, light energy, gadgetry, martial arts, psionics, super strength, and weapon mastery. And each of these power sets will include eventually 48 different powers. Now, when you select these, first you get an inherent effect based on your power set that you get from the get-go. For earth manipulation, for example, every time you affect an enemy with one of your earth manipulation abilities, you actually will gain shielding. Shielding is a type of damage reduction, which characters also have damage reduction in this game. So it's just making your character extra tanky, and the shielding value can be up to 10 points of damage reduction, or twice the value you can create, whichever is higher. At level 1, you only can really create 4 base shielding, so that would be double 8. 10 is higher, so you go up to 10. But at level 5, it's 6 plus half your control modifier, which likely at this point will be 8 times 2, 16 shielding if you're affecting an enemy multiple times, and this armor continuously stacks as you use it, which is really, really cool. And each of these power sets include a unique ability and some base powers. These base powers are essentially your beginning bread and butter, a lot of stuff you're going to be using, and mostly stuff that doesn't include or doesn't need drive to use. And then as you level, you'll be able to select powers from higher and higher tiers. Now in the primer, we only go up to tier 3, but when the full book releases, it's going to be even higher than this, which I think is going to be a lot of fun. And we have additional talents, more customization for your character. These talents will allow you to make your character more unique, and the talents are based on your specific archetype and power set combination, which is really cool. One of my favorite ones for the Arbiter and Gadgetry tree combination is Healing Dart, where whenever you affect an enemy with a range targeted gadget power, you can heal yourself or an ally within range by an amount equal to your damage modifier, but your gadgets no longer just do damage. This is really great if you have a lot of powers that just give certain status conditions to an enemy and you're not really trying to kill them, and give your team a lot of extra survivability. I'm a big support person myself, so something like this is really, really cool. And they have this for every single archetype and power set combination. So considering that there are currently 5 archetypes and 10 powers, that's 50 different talent trees essentially that you can select from. And this is expected to go up to 1,500 talents when the game actually releases, which is really, really cool. It's something that I'm very excited to see, and the different combinations, what kind of characters you make, and the abilities themselves look like they're very fun to use and have been very fun to use. Now, I'm not going to claim I have a ton of experience in this game. I don't know where it breaks, but this is kind of just like a beta test, a primer, as you will. And they definitely can tweak the game a little bit more before it fully releases. But I'm feeling pretty confident that this is an insanely fun game. And there's even more. There's injury tables. So your injuries are not just reductions in HP, but actually affect your character, which is kind of cool. And they have such a chunky rule set. They have lifestyle rules and all kinds of things that can bring your game to life. So what are my final thoughts on Indominant? Well, first of all, something I'm going to be doing with my videos moving forward is I'm going to place the games on my narrative gaming scale. So this scale indicates how far a game leans on the narrative gaming scale. A 5 is actually a pretty good result because it means that the game has a perfect blend of narrative and gaming elements that really make it synergize. While a result of 1 isn't a bad game, it's just a game that is much more narrative focused and is very, very light on the rules, while a game on the 10 scale is a very, very chunky game that only really adds to the story by grace of what your characters are capable of or not, and the game doesn't really offer many narrative elements. As for Indominant, I'm going to place it at a 7 to 8, somewhere in this range. There's not a lot of very narrative elements. There's some with the origins and your species and the like, but not many of the mechanics actively support this kind of thing, and compared to a lot of other more narratively focused games, it's just not quite there. But it's an incredibly chunky game that offers you a lot of rules. So if you are a player who likes more of a simulation style game, then I think Indominant might be a game that you would like. And of course, this is only the primer. I haven't seen the full game, and I might do a short update video on any of the changes when that comes around. But I say this game is really good. I think it's got a lot of potential. And if you are newer to TTRPGs, but you are really wanting to dive into something that feels a little bit crunchier, a little bit more filled out than maybe D&D 5e, then I think this might be the game for you. Granted, there's not as many books. This is still a work in progress. We only really have the primer out, and it's a very small company, so you can't expect a lot to be coming out for this game in the years to come, or at least not at a rate like Paizo does, or even Hasbro does with D&D. Granted, they mostly just come out with adventure modules, let's be honest. So I think this game has a lot of potential. It's a really fun game, and if you want to pick up the primer now, you can do it for $30 on RPG Drive-Thru, or you can go through the backer kit and back it that way. Then you can get the primer and the book when it fully releases. I think this is definitely worth your time. I'm going to leave a link to their website down in the description below so you can check it out. And speaking on, while you're down there, let me know what you think of it. Indominant. Do you think this is an interesting game? Do you want to check it out? I would definitely like to hear it. And of course, it helps the algorithm as we get into this year of new variety tabletop games. Every like, every comment, every view really, really helps. And even if it's not my videos, if other people are making videos on games that you are interested in, please interact with the algorithm. Let's show people that people are interested in more variety tabletop games. I'm tired of the monoliths. I'm tired of and nothing wrong with people who like games like D&D or even Pathfinder at this point, but I do want to see more variety in the tabletop sphere, and I want to see more money and stuff flowing into those areas. And the only way we can do that is with exposure here online. Anyway, that's going to be it for me. Thank y'all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.